And this is where Central Hudson starts to fall apart. What is the government interest in that? If the government believes, for example, that drug prices are prohibitively expensive to the point that it's restricting patient access to medications, or if they believe that overprescribing is creating drug shortages, or any other reason that presents a risk to public health, they have to articulate that. And they need to articulate why other options that don't intrinsically infringe on the First Amendment and protected commercial speech aren't sufficient to mitigate the risk.
Hi, everyone. This is Virginia Foley and Jason Cober from Compliance Forward. We are back today. We're going to call this Adequate Provision Part 2. So we're continuing our analysis of the announcement of the unified agenda of the FDA's intention to revise 21 CFR 202.1. That's a fancy way of saying, remember when HHS called adequate provision a loophole? Well, that announcement mischaracterizes the 1999 final guidance on adequate provision and also directly links DTC television advertising to the rising cost of prescription drugs. Jason, in our last podcast on the subject, you said that this proposed rule wasn't the most robust strategy. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. So I think as industry's had a few weeks to kind of sit with this and digest what the agency announced in the unified agenda, they've kind of come up with a few different potential strategies for how to push back on this. Invariably, I think the most direct approach, if the agency does move forward, is going to be a challenge under the First Amendment. And anytime we're talking about challenges to commercial speech that is constitutionally protected, it's going to come back to the Central Hudson decisions. Central Hudson was a 1980 Supreme Court case that established a multi-pronged test that helps determine if regulated commercial speech violates the First Amendment. So during the 1970s, the state of New York wanted to curtail the advertising and promotion around electric utilities. Those utilities obviously pushed back. They said, no, this is protected commercial speech. And this case eventually got to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court, in deciding the case, evaluated the constitutionality of the regulation through 4 tests. The first thing that they said was, is the communication misleading? They said the communication must not be misleading or related to an illegal activity. So that's the first test. If it passes that, then the government has to assert a substantial interest. What is the government's interest in basically restricting First Amendment protected speech? That has to be a very high bar that the government clears in order to move forward. Then the government has to clearly show that the regulation directly advances that interest. And finally, the regulation of that commercial speech has to be narrowly tailored in a way that it's not overly burdensome, it's not excessively restrictive. So the Hudson test is what we would expect, or Central Hudson test, I'm sorry, should be applied to whatever the agency is proposing to do here with their proposed rule to restrict adequate provision. Now, the announcement in the unified agenda and even the press releases, the fact sheet, the presidential memo that were issued in September 2025 make it clear that the administration considers DTC drug advertising to have numerous negative characteristics, but they have so far failed to articulate a substantial interest that withstands any kind of scrutiny.
Totally agree. So let's keep going with that. Why do you think it doesn't withstand scrutiny?
The position that the agency has carved out is based on several easily refutable mischaracterizations, which is never a good starting point when we're talking about policymaking. So first of all, the agency has repeatedly referred to adequate provision as a loophole, and they point to 1999 as this inflection point where the FDA permitted companies to begin DTC advertising on television. But this isn't accurate. The regulation that created the option to satisfy the brief summary requirement in broadcast ads was published in the late 1960s. In 1999, the FDA finalized a guidance that articulated the agency's position on how companies could make adequate provision, but it didn't explicitly permit advertising on television. So you could argue that the guidance enabled DTC television advertising by clarifying what was up to that point a vague and not well understood provision of the regulations. But the first fully branded DTC television ad actually ran in 1983. It was for a prescription drug product named Rufen. And the pharmaceutical industry was actively promoting on television throughout the 1990s in the form of reminder and help-seeking ads. So it's not accurate to say that the agency permitted or otherwise opened the floodgates for DTC advertising in 1999, and they certainly didn't create a loophole. Second, the agency is making a connection between the cost of prescription drug prices and the cost of advertising of these products. So the implication there is that drug prices are too high. And this is a product of the increasing ad spend on the part of manufacturers. Effectively, the government is suggesting that drug prices would be lower if manufacturers didn't spend so much on advertising these products. And this is where Central Hudson starts to fall apart. What is the government interest in that? If the government believes, for example, that drug prices are prohibitively expensive to the point that it's restricting patient access to medications, or if they believe that overprescribing is creating drug shortages, or any other reason that presents a risk to public health, they have to articulate that. And they need to articulate why other options that don't intrinsically infringe on the First Amendment and protected commercial speech aren't sufficient to mitigate the risk.
Good points. Thank you. So going back to the DTC guidance from 1999, and I'm old enough to remember when that came out, actually. Did the agency seek input from the public? Like, how does that work with such an important guidance?
They did. And we've been going, you and I have been going back and forth and talking about this a lot since the unified agenda went up. And for me, the interesting perspective has been what did drug advertising look like before 1999, and trying to get a sense of, what were companies doing to promote their drugs on television. And the reason I'm interested in that perspective is because the agency doesn't make policy decisions in a vacuum. They do look at what is happening in the regulated space to help inform their decision making. And we have on the record how the agency came to the decision to publish that 1999 guidance. We also have a lot of information about how they evaluated the follow on effects after they published that guidance. So first of all, the agency clearly identified the risks around DTC television in the 1980s and in the lead up to the issuance of the adequate provision guidance in 1999. They hosted a public meeting in 1995 where they sought information from the public. They then issued the draft guidance of the adequate provision guidance in 1997, which was open to public comment. Finally, in conjunction with the publication of the 1999 final guidance, the agency committed to conducting and then completed 2 follow-up studies regarding the effects of DTC advertising on consumer perceptions of DTC advertising and prescribing behaviors. These findings, along with the agency's position on DTC television, were shared during a 2-day public hearing held in September of 2003. And I would actually argue that hearing in 2003 was as pivotal to the agency's decision making as the issuance of the 1999 guidance.
I agree. Yeah, this is a really kind of exciting period in drug promotion history. And I was working during that time, so I'm kind of going down memory lane here. But can you remind us what was the outcome of the 2003 meeting? Because this is a tremendous amount of effort that was put into coming up with this guidance for industry.
Yeah, so we have the transcripts from the 2003 meeting. They're available online and they're available publicly. So you can actually read through the entire 2-day meeting to see what the agency said on the record and what was presented to the agency as well. So the panel that was at this meeting consisted of Dr. Janet Woodcock, who was the Cedar Center director at the time, Tom Abrams, who was the DDMAC director. Of course, DDMAC is the precursor to OPDP. But Cedar leadership was also on this panel. You had CBER leadership, you had leadership from throughout the agency. And it was an opportunity for the public to come and share their concerns, but also show research that supported or pushed back against DTC advertising. So in 2003, we see Dr. Woodcock gave opening remarks, and she noted in her opening remarks that public attitudes towards healthcare and prescription drugs were shifting. She noted that patients and caregivers wanted to take a more active role in their healthcare decisions. And the agency had observed this shift over a series of decades. They traced the origins of these shifting attitudes back to the late 1970s to early 1980s. And they were acknowledging the fact that consumers and patients and caregivers, they wanted to be more involved in the decision-making process. Some of this was a result of the rise of managed care, HMOs, and PPOs and whatnot, but a lot of this too was the availability of information. So consumers had access to a lot more information, and they wanted to have a better understanding of what therapies and what treatments were available. They didn't want to just go to the doctor and be told, this is the treatment plan and this is what we're going to do. They wanted to know going into these appointments what their options were and to be able to have a conversation with their HCP before decisions were made. So that was a huge motivating factor that the agency talked about in 2003. Tom Abrams, the DDMAC director, he also noted a few things. First of all, in his opening remarks, he emphatically notes that the 1999 guidance did not change the law, it didn't loosen the requirements, it was simply providing guidance on how industry could satisfy the adequate provision requirement. Of course, this was in the regulations well before 1999. Now, Tom also notes that the landscape looked quite a bit different prior to 1999. He noted that the current TV ads at the time, prior to 1999, were reminder and help seeking ads, but they were actually creating more confusion because patients and caregivers didn't know what the products were approved for and they didn't know what the risks were. And it was actually creating a lot of confusion when patients went to talk to their healthcare providers, potentially about products that weren't approved for the conditions that they had. Now, what's also interesting to me is that Tom also states that the agency was very aware of the emergence of the internet as a source of medical information. And the agency was already expressing concerns about the availability of misinformation on the internet. So, for this reason, the agency saw value in an approach that could reach a broad section of the population. They wanted to reach as many people as possible with truthful and not misleading information. And this was a motivating factor for why they published the guidance and why they didn't try to restrict TV ad promotion beyond what's in that 1999 guidance. Now, Dr. Woodcock, at the end of her remarks, notes that there are a number of risks associated with this approach. They were aware of the risks associated with the path that they were setting the agency on. And she notes that DTC drug advertising is neither wholly good nor wholly bad. But what we get from the 2003 meeting is that the agency is trying to seek balance, and they're trying to find a balanced solution to a very complex problem.
Yes. Okay. Yes, and yes, and yes. I agree with all of this. I really appreciate you going back into the archives and finding the meeting minutes, and I think we'll be able to post that with our podcast too, so people can read it for themselves from the 2003 meeting. A couple things to think about here. I've always been a strong proponent that more isn't necessarily better, quality versus quantity. And I think that really applies for risk presentation. You just shared with me before we started talking one of the summaries from the study conclusion that that this came from FDA, that limiting the risks presented in DTC television ads and including a disclosure alerting consumers that not all risks are presented may be an effective strategy for communicating the product risk. So, that is what we've been working with all along. We work really hard as professionals when we're reviewing content to make sure that the serious and actionable risks are presented in a clear and conspicuous neutral manner. Boom, that's number 2. We just finished the CCN guidance, right? Industry and FDA came together, worked on the new rule, got it into the regs, and we had a year to implement it, and there was public comment. This is the way to do it, and everybody complied. And CCN has, well, not everybody, as we've seen, but it's become the rule of law, and that's how we work to mitigate risks in the ads and be able to display them appropriately. So that just came out in 2023. So what gives? Why are we talking about adequate provision being a loophole now? It makes no sense. We've done all this foundational work to be able to provide risk assessments in ad in fair balance with efficacy. And it's not easy to do that in 60 seconds or 90 seconds. But I think we're doing well. And if we're not, FDA has all the tools in their toolbox to be able to warn manufacturers if they're not doing it right and make changes. None of this adds up, and I'm glad we're talking about it. This research came out of the OPDP research team that's no longer there, so I don't think we're going to see any more guidance from them anytime soon. So we're not sure. We're going to see what's going to happen now. I think there are going to be some legal challenges. Don't have a crystal ball. But I just am curious to see where this is going to go next. But we're talking about it. We'd love to hear from you. Any closing thoughts from you, Jason?
I think policymaking in the government, it's a difficult proposition. You're trying to strike that balance, and the agency has always tried to strike a balance. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where you're never going to make everyone happy. In fact, there's always going to be people who say, the government went too far, and then there's people on the other side that say the government didn't go far enough. And you very seldom find groups where they say, yeah, the government took the right tact here. I do want to say that we don't have to speculate on how the government came to their decision in 1999. It's written out in the 2003 meeting minutes. And I see a lot of parallels in what the government talks about in 2003 to where we are today with the rising emergence of using AI for finding medical information, the prevalence of misinformation on the internet. And I think that when you read through the information that the government shared, and then you read through the presentations that were then shared publicly with the government, it's very clear how the government came to their decision. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to avoid mischaracterizations of adequate provision as a loophole.
Perfect close. Thank you so much for taking this on. It's a tough topic, but that's what we do. We're happy to talk to anyone about this. If you want to leave us comments and let us know what you think. So this has been the Promotional Intelligence Podcast. If you like what you see, follow us on YouTube. Thank you so much.